Hey all, MotoTubo here with another guitar video, sort of a guitar video. It's a guitar amp video, and specifically I'm going to talk tubes. As you may have heard, Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. As guitar players, we often don't think world events affect us. After all, we simply need to rock out a bit and everything will fall into place, right? Well, this time you might be wrong. Now, if you believe the YouTube hype, those little glowing bottles of joy in our amps are going to get scarce real fast. And if you can find them for sale, they're going to get expensive real fast. I mean, that's kind of how it works, supply and demand. Demand doesn't change and supply goes down, price goes up. All of this is not entirely untrue, but please don't get your panties in a wad yet. In the US, we call these things vacuum tubes or just tubes. In Europe and elsewhere, they're called valves. No matter what we call them, many of us guitar players rely on them to sound our best at home, in the studio, and on stage. And yes, I am reading from a script. That's why my eyes keep going up and down, because I don't want to forget any of this. After a little bit of background and some analysis of the situation right now, March 2022, I'm going to give you, in a separate video, 10 tips to help your tubes last as long as possible and your tube amps sound as good as they can for as long as they can. Stay tuned through the background, check out the description, get the link to the other video, and everything will be cool. Now, I realize that as somebody who is trained as a historian, which now you know that about me, I have a slight advantage over most other guitar players. I know a lot about European history, and lucky for me, that information is valuable right now. I'm also a researcher. That's a skill that has come in handy a lot, and it's really coming in handy now. I know a good bit about amps, and I've known for a long time where our tube amps come from and where the tubes that go in them are made. Now, tubes used to be made all over the world, including the United States, the UK, Germany, everywhere. Making tubes isn't necessarily highly skilled labor. It is a process. It's fairly hands-on, and keeping the quality high, meaning that you get good consistency, requires a lot of attentive hand assembly. So labor costs are typically a significant portion of the cost of tube manufacturing. Now, that's probably the biggest reason the manufacture of tubes moved overseas. Demand in the United States especially went down, labor costs went up, so it's easier and cheaper to make them overseas. Now, another reason tubes aren't made in places like the United States and Germany anymore is because the manufacturing of tubes is kind of hard on the environment. There are a lot of the processes and parts that have significant environmental impacts. And back in the 20th century, when everything had tubes in it, that wasn't really a big deal because we simply didn't care about the environment the way we do now in the 21st century. As electronics technology advanced, though, the vacuum tubes became largely obsolete. And after a while, tubes were only used in things like televisions and guitar amps and some high-end audio amps. If you really want to get into a deep, muddy discussion about tubes, talk to somebody who's an audiophile and has like a $30,000 turntable. Anyway, some bass amps use them, and that's kind of it. Tubes aren't really used widespread anymore. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the Russian economy was in a shambles. At the same time, the Russian government was forced to give up on controlling businesses as tightly as they had before. During Soviet times, almost every business was state-controlled. As that happened, Russian companies began to export things that they had previously only made for domestic purposes. Now, that includes vacuum tubes. Also, it became possible for Western companies to bring manufacturing money into Russia, which was something that had never happened before. Now, the introduction of the integrated circuit into widespread use starting in the 1950s started the slow demise of tube circuits in everyday products. So by the late 1980s and early 1990s, Soviet technology was still a little bit behind, one generation behind, just because they didn't need to advance as quickly as the rest of the world. So a lot of their tube manufacturing infrastructure was still fairly robust compared to the rest of the world that had largely offshored tube production. Western entrepreneurs were able to step in and provide a market for the newly deregulated tube industry in Russia, and we started to see brands like Sovtek, Svetlana, Winged Sea, and Tungsol start to emerge in the guitar amp world. And one of, if not the biggest, tube manufacturing facilities in the world is in Russia, and it is also currently owned by an American, the folks that run Electro Harmonics, as far as I know. Now, the Chinese were in a similar place as the Russians in their tube manufacturing, but wouldn't start exporting tubes for another decade, at least maybe two, when their domestic use dropped to almost zero because of advances in technology, and their economy globalized to include the United States and other countries on the forward edge of technological development. Besides Russia and China, the only other tube factory that I know of making tubes for use in amplifiers these days is in the Slovak Republic, which is an Eastern European country that used to be part of the Soviet Union and was half of Czechoslovakia. Now they're two separate countries, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, although we do still call it Slovakia. Right now, March 2022, that Slovakian factory is the only one exporting tubes to the rest of the world. Those tubes are mostly made under a brand called JJ. One of the main Chinese tube factories suffered a major fire, a massive fire, in 2019, and their production hasn't really come back fully yet. As a matter of fact, I think they're operating at a small margin of their previous production output. They've been able to continue exporting tubes simply by relying on their production stocks. They had a huge buildup in their warehouses, so they could afford to go down for a little while, but now it's been close to 2 whole years since that fire. And those warehouses are getting low, so getting Chinese tubes is even getting a little tough right now. Now, in my opinion, and yes, this is absolutely opinion because this is obviously me talking, using Chinese tubes for your guitar amp is a little difficult. It's not impossible. We can debate their sonic characteristics all day long, but that's not what I'm talking about right here. What I'm talking about here is, even though most of them sound fine, what concerns me about Chinese tubes is their consistency and their reliability. I'll tell you a story about retubing a friend's amp just a couple of years ago before the fire and why it was so much work. Now, my friend's amp was made in China, so it was optimized to use these Chinese-made tubes. That's a good plan. However, in the first batch of tubes that he bought, 2 of the preamp tubes and 1 of the power amp tubes were simply dead right out of the box. The power tube was microphonic, and if you don't know what that means, it means that it squeals and makes other unpleasant sounds. The preamp tubes that were bad were so far below nominal that I told him to just throw them in the trash. They were worthless. In the end, we did get his amp retubed, but he had to buy 10 preamp tubes to get the 4 that he needed. And he had to buy 6 power amp tubes to get a properly matched pair. He only needed 2. It ended up costing him about the same as if he had retubed with a set of more consistent Russian-made tubes. And that's really where the Russian tubes excelled. It's not that they sounded necessarily any better than any other tube, but you could get consistent tubes from this Russian factory, these Russian factories, all day long. They were always easy to match, and they were always consistently pretty high quality. Now, as far as Russian tubes go, well, there's 2 things going on. Remember, I won't be buying any Russian products at all until the war is over, and has been over for a good long time. That's one, and that's a personal thing. I don't expect anybody else to ever do anything just because I'm doing it. And I don't expect you to either. If you want to buy Russian tubes, you go right ahead and buy Russian tubes. Number 2 is even more simple. Russia has stopped exporting products to any nation which has leveled economic sanctions on it. That includes the United States, so we're not getting any tubes from the Russian factory, if it's even running right now, period, end of story, until at least the end of this year and possibly into next year or the year after. We just don't know. This could be the end of tube manufacturing in Russia as we know it. It very well could be. We simply do not and will not know for some time. Between the tube factory fire in China and Russia banning exports, that means the only new tubes you can get that aren't already on somebody's shelves are JJ's from Slovakia. And guess what? Yeah, they're totally overloaded and backlogged right now. And apparently they're running about 6 months behind their orders. And that's only going to increase during this whole situation. If you were smart, and normally I don't crow about my intelligence because I'm really not all that smart, but in this case, I saw what was coming and I bought myself a batch of JJ tubes about 2 days after the Russians invaded Ukraine. If you were smart and paying attention to the news, you also stocked up already and are sitting there feeling just a little bit superior to the YouTube crybabies who just realized the wall of free amps behind them in all of their videos might turn into giant paperweights. Now, I do have an advantage. I paid for my amps, and I'm just saying that. I'm not superior to anybody. Those of you currently scrambling to find tubes are discovering depleted stocks from the typical retailers, and if you can find the tubes you need in stock, the prices have gone up almost as much as 50% in some cases. Seriously, the JJ preamp tubes I bought in February cost me 28 bucks a piece, which is already a fairly high price, but JJ has a reputation for high quality, so I don't mind paying the high price. Those same tubes are now selling for $46 a piece from the same retailer. Well, selling is a strong word. You can put in your email address and get on their list to be notified when their tubes are back in stock, but you're going to have to buy them at that higher price when they do come back. Now, I've heard from a few sources that the JJ factory, like I said, is about 6 months behind in fulfilling their orders. That backlog is absolutely going to grow as people shift their orders for Chinese or Russian tubes over to the JJs. In the meantime, you can chastise yourself for not having any backup tubes like Wes always does, and I did already have a stash of backup tubes before I ordered these new ones. So you can sit there and chastise yourself and wish that you had backup tubes, or you can check out my next video that's the 10 tips for prolonging the life of your tubes. Then you don't have to come off as a crybaby like some of these big YouTube guitar players. And I'm just saying, you know, maybe they're just looking for clicks. Maybe, just maybe. I don't want to disparage anybody beyond calling them a crybaby. And you can decide who I'm talking about because I'm not going to mention any names, because some of these folks actually have a lot of great information on their channels and some of them seem pretty cool. I've never met any of them. I'm just over here making motorcycle videos mostly. So they're looking to build their brand and they think you're concerned about the situation in the tube world right now. And that's why they're putting out these the end of tubes as we know it videos. I'm going to split off the 10 tips into a separate video right here. So like, subscribe, and all that stuff. Come back for that video. In the meantime, don't worry. Play your guitar, have fun, consume the tips, come back, enjoy, take it easy. These things don't change overnight, and everything is going to eventually be fine. Someday, and we don't know when that day comes, yes, they are going to stop manufacturing tubes. That's a simple fact. Then we're all going to have to go digital. But it's not this week, it's not next month, and it's probably not even next year. It's probably not even in the next 10 years. So don't feel like you got to go buy one of those crazy, high, expensive digital modelers to get the sound coming out of your tube amps. You don't. Take it easy. Maybe have some dip and relax. Take it easy. Come back for the next video.